Um, in social linguistics, we can observe how language both reflects and influences culture. So the influence between language and culture is two-way. And a good example of how the Japanese language gives a clue to the Japanese culture is the levels of politeness. There are multiple ways of saying anything. And that's not just a matter of saying would you like instead of do you want, or adding please and thank yous. It's a matter of verb forms, that any verb can be changed and is changed and will be changed and expressed differently depending on who's talking, who they're talking to, whether there is seniority involved, whether there is a customer um, or client relationship there, boss to subordinate, parent to, or adult to child, teacher to student, even senpai to kohai. Senpai and kohai are just people of different year groups. Senpai is someone older and therefore senior. Kohai, someone younger and therefore junior. They can be within the same company, a 29-year-old and a 28-year-old. Senpai and kohai, and the senpai will speak in a more casual form of address to the kohai, and the kohai will have to use more respectful language. There's respectful language, there's honorific language, and yes, this is going to be manifested in absolutely any sentence, any verb, and that shows immediately when you start to learn Japanese and learn about this country how much hierarchy, not just politeness and deference, but hierarchy is part of the culture. There is a wonderful irony about Kazuyoshi Miura in that, as one of the stars of the early J-League era, so in the early mid-1990s, when he was still young, of course, he's 53 now, about to turn 54. J-League starting 28 years ago as a full league season. So yeah, he's in his mid-20s then, when he was a member of the Yomiuri teams, which then became Verdi Kawasaki. He was one of the younger players, and he wasn't having any of that superiority, inferiority thing, age-based superiority. His view was that he was a player, a professional player, and within the dressing room, he should be seen as such. There should be no deference to people of other generations of different ages. And that obviously makes sense. Japan's professional team sport culture comes from baseball, where there is more leeway for hierarchy, and indeed individual plays are coached. You have a coach on the sidelines telling the batter to aim for a home run or to bunt or to do whatever. That is possible within the very nature of baseball, and so that was quite an easy fit within Japanese society. Football, obviously, you can't coach individual plays. In baseball, you can have older senior players getting preferential treatment in terms of the positions they play, perhaps, or their position within the batting order. Football, it's harder to do that, and you can't coach individual plays. But in the 1980s, when you had the quasi semi-professional league here, it was officially not professional. It was company teams, and their employees played, but they hired ringers and gave them menial, superficial jobs within the companies. But in those days, you had the old-fashioned sort of baseball-style hierarchy, whereby in the dressing room, junior players would have to address senior players with this deference, speak to them politely. Sometimes felt the need to pass the senior players the ball rather than do something more individualistic with it or do something more progressive with it. It's like, no, we'll give the senior player the ball. Kaz was not having any of that. Once he was a player on the team, it didn't matter how old his teammate was, he would speak to them normally, which would come off as a bit abrasive, someone, a Japanese person in their 30s, say, like, "What? Who's this kid speaking to me as if I'm the same age as him or as if I'm older than him?" And that was something that existed at the time. It was something that existed with the way he spoke to the press. He didn't consider that he needed to be super polite to the media either, even if the journalists we know in their 30s, 40s, even older. He was a player on the team. That was his status. He didn't think that the hierarchies were relevant. And so the irony is that he is undoubtedly now benefiting from the fact that Japanese society is hierarchical, is respectful of elders, because, as you probably imply with your question, there is something particular to the Japanese culture that facilitates and makes possible a career that lasts so long in professional football. And so Kazu, he was the star, certainly the Japanese star, of the early J-League boom, of the era of the J-League where it had the most presence within Japanese popular culture. It's a stronger, more healthy league now over the last 10 years or so than it ever was. But in terms of its real presence within people who didn't necessarily know much about football, but it had a big boom when the J-League started, and he was the most famous face. His role in building up the J-League is therefore respected. So he's not just a player who's played a long time. He's a player who's had a great career and a player who was perhaps the most important Japanese player at the most important time of Japanese football's development. And so he enjoys a high status within the hierarchy.